As a small recap, we were actually discussing different use cases around placement, and uh, there seem to be both pros and cons of keeping the placement resource as a separate resource, and possibility of multiple resources also. Uh, so the last meeting when we broke off, uh, when we broke off, there was thought that we might give a little more thought around the same issues and then sync up again. So, and one more stuff was that Quinton suggested a proposal on proximity and probably anti-proximity. We can talk about that also if time permits. Or Quinton, have you been able to put something? I think you mentioned that you might try to put something.
Yeah, I just briefly spent half an hour this morning dumping my thoughts in a document. It's not finished yet, but we can talk about it if there's time and if anyone's interested.
Okay.
It's 2 pages right now, so it's not very comprehensive.
I think the proposal as written covers a lot of possibilities. I'm looking personally just for probably the simplest one. Like I have an application and I have resources that comprise that application. I want to make sure those resources are co-located in the same cluster. How would you anticipate this being implemented to make at least that very simple case possible?
Okay, if we want to talk about it now, I can do that. So basically, in summary, there's a range. So on the one end of the range, there is basically same cluster, which gives you very high failure correlation relatively and very low latency, network latency. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have clusters on opposite ends of the world, possibly even in different cloud providers, which provides you with very low failure correlation, but very high latency. And typically what you do is you say, I'm happy within some sub-range of that range for these two resources, and then the scheduler can schedule accordingly. So to answer your question, Maru, in that case, what you would just say is that I specifically wanted to be in the same cluster, and then the scheduler will do that. But then there are other options. So you can just specify a sub-range that is different than that, and you give the scheduler more flexibility as to where it can put your things. Put them in. And then what I still need to fill in is how you do the anti-correlation stuff, which is based on the same range.
And how would this be represented at the API level?
Same sort of thing. So you would have a proximity constraint, and you would say, this thing should be proximate to this other thing with a value on that range, or a range of values on that range.
And this would live on the resource itself or in a separate resource?
TBD, I think. I would imagine that one would want multiple of these things, and they're kind of symmetrical in the sense that if you have a config map and a replica set, and you want them to be in the same cluster, then it's not clear whether it should live in the replica set or in the config map. So, you know, one way is to put it outside in a kind of a binding thing. But we could put it in either of the two instead. And I also imagine there will be potentially multiple of these constraints per resource. So you might want this replica set in the same cluster as its config map, but in a different cluster than its backup, for example. And one should be able to specify that.
I am warm to the idea of having like a separate resource that describes these concepts. I do think that this sounds like, I don't want to say entangled, but at least peripherally related to placement and policy too.
Absolutely, yeah, and also has a lot of commonalities with taints, tolerations, and there's a specific thing in Kubernetes, I forget the name off the top of my head, which is basically proximity. But it is, in a sense, more difficult because it's not as clear in Kubernetes where those values lie. Is a pod on the same node important? Is a pod on a different node in the same rack? And like, what does your network architecture look like inside your data center and all that stuff? So there's a lot more scope for arguing about what the sensible points on the continuum of proximities are in the case of Kubernetes. I think it's a much less complicated thing in the case of federation, in the sense that your units are clusters. They're pretty big things, and they by definition sit inside an availability zone right now. There's no way of having a cluster span availability zones, and I'm not sure they ever, sorry, not availability zones, regions. And I don't think we will ever have single clusters spanning different regions. And that's an explicit kind of stated goal of Kubernetes. And similarly, yeah, I mean, I think there's a huge difference between in-cluster networking and cross-cluster networking and cross-cloud provider networking. So there's no argument that there's a big step function there. Whereas there are a lot of arguments about, if you're on the same node, is that like lower latency than in the same rack or not? Is it significant? If you're in the rack next door, is that significantly slower than being in the same rack? And so it's a lot more blurry in the case of Kubernetes, whereas here it's pretty obvious. The speed of light comes into play pretty quickly. Even, both being on the East Coast versus being on the East and the West Coast, there's a pretty big delta there of, tens of milliseconds. So most people care about whether they're like on the East and the West Coast or both on the West Coast. So we can haggle about some of those values, but they're relatively uncontentious, I think. I think you're muted, Paul.
Party foul. So I'm trying to resolve in my head whether, like, if you think about putting the kind of correlation like stickiness or gravity into a resource, whether, like, when we talk about placement and also like in the continuum that we discussed on Monday of at the simple uninteresting end is like declarative, no policy. At the other end of the spectrum is like you have some kind of like policy agent or business rules that make decisions about placement. Whether it makes sense to model those in terms of individual resources or in terms of like a group of resources that travel together.
Yeah, I think that's a very pertinent question. I totally agree with you. I guess the challenge becomes one of kind of complexity of expression. So it's reasonably easy to express, well, maybe not, and I haven't got that in the doc yet, and I don't have any concrete ideas about it. It feels intuitively relatively simple to express a proximity relationship between strictly two things. If you specify a proximity relationship between many things, does that mean that like does that explode into like a proximity between every pair of things in that group? Is that bounded by the same range? Maybe it is. And maybe that is a useful abstraction that users will like and be able to use. there's another complication which I haven't really spelled out yet, and which I don't have any strong feelings about. But you know, when you have a federated resource, let's say you have a replica set and potentially needs to get spread between 3 clusters, and now you want a replica set. There's a sort of subtle difference between I want this replica set in the same cluster as every one of the shards of my, sorry, I want this config map in every one of the same clusters as my sharded replica set. So that seems like a reasonable requirement, versus I want my config map somewhere in the same region as all of my replica set shards, for example. So it's kind of, it seems like in some cases you actually want to talk about the shards of a federated thing and proximity to them. And in other cases, you might want to speak about the actual federated thing. So if this federated thing lives in a given region, because my constraints on that say that it all needs to fall in the same region, then my other thing, config map, let's say, or snapshot, or whatever it happens to be, should be in the same region as those things. So yeah, I mean, we need to figure out that level of detail, but I think before we even get there, we need to decide whether this concept of a proximity scale is useful in the first place, and whether we think we can expand that to be a useful concrete API.
I think that, or good morning. I think that you know, there's sort of different use cases here, right? There's like the minimum proximity requirements between things. There's the like, I need things co-located, like you're just saying, for like the config maps. And there's like the anti-proximity, or like the
Totally agree.
These 3 different sort of types of things we need to express here.
Yeah, and so that's how I came up with this idea of the proximity scale thing, and this stuff I kind of dreamed up long ago in the context of AWS, and have run into this problem several times since then, and eventually so did it there internally, and then also did it in the context of Google services. So the idea there is that you can, so this is like a general model. So we went through all of these various different requirements, and it seems like you can express many, or argue possibly all of the ones we thought of, with a kind of unified model. And the unified model basically says, how close is the closest that I can tolerate, and how far is the furthest that I can tolerate? And then by simply specifying those 2 extremes of my permissible range, I can get what I want without specifying in more detail than I want to exactly where I want things, because I do want to give the scheduler some flexibility to choose where to put things. And I do want my policy to be able to perhaps restrict where I can put things specifically. So as soon as I specify, I want this in this cluster and this other one in that cluster, because implicitly I know those 2 clusters are close enough together for me, then either policy could decide that I'm not allowed in there, or there might not be capacity in there, and then everything kind of, there's much less scope for automated kind of decision making. But if you express in simple terms what your actual constraints are, that, you know, I want to be in different clusters in the same region, but I don't care which region, then the scheduler can, and the policy can influence precisely where you end up going within the policy constraints and the availability constraint, or rather capacity, availability constraints, etc. So that was sort of the thinking behind it. But I agree, there are at least 3 or 4 somewhat discrete use cases. But rather than come up with a different solution to each one, it seems intuitively preferable to come up with a unified solution that can answer all of those in a fairly simple way.
I think I would be concerned about the implementation complexity for simpler use cases. But I agree that this is sort of it solves everything you'd want to do. I think I'm just concerned about the user experience, and I would hope that we could iterate and provide a simplified model of this for simpler use cases, maybe backed by the more complicated model.
I think it's probably totally feasible for a given deployment of the Federation to say, the only valid range is same cluster, and all the other ones we just don't know what to do with, and we'll just ignore them or something.
Quentin, was this part of the brain dump that you did this morning?
Yes, this is the brain dump.
Okay.
I mean, I didn't explicitly state that that this range could be configurable per deployment, but I'm just thinking out loud now.
Yeah, I just wondered if I missed like a link to the doc or something, or if it was.
Yeah, I just emailed it out to the group about 20 minutes ago, and it's also in the chat of this call.
Okay, I think I joined late.
Yeah,
Would you mind dropping that back into the chat for me?
Sure.
I think, there's sort of a utility in the context of scheduling. I was kind of thinking in a more restricted sort of sense of if I had an environment that wasn't actually doing like dynamic scheduling, but was applying policy, and you'd have a case where the policy is misapplied, maybe because the labeling is bad or something, such that, the config map would say, oh, you're going to these clusters, and the replica set, you're going to these clusters, and those would be disjoint.
Mm-hmm.
And this would be a way of a user expressing something that the policy engine could consider and say, hey, there seems to be a problem here. I'm trying to impose placement on these two resources, but there's a dependency here that won't be met if I do so.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And in my mind, that there are things that the application deployer cares about, and things like latency and failure correlation are amongst those things. And then I think there are things that policies care about, and those are things like which cloud provider do I prefer, and where's my cheapest stuff, and which clusters am I trying to drain right now, and therefore I want to push stuff into other clusters or whatever. So this falls squarely, I believe, in the application deployer requirements as opposed to the administrator policy requirements.
Yeah, I was going to ask, where you saw this falling relative to policy. And I think this is a very interesting distinction to kind of, further tease out the the differences between something that's a primitive that says this thing goes here versus policy that says things like this can only go here.
Or can't go there. Yeah.
The layer of I want these things to go wherever they go together.
So I don't think that's really a policy thing. I think that's an application deployment thing.
Right, and I'm saying that this has been very useful for me to start untangling exactly where the boundaries lie.
Yeah, and I see Torrens on the call. I don't want to preclude OPA or a policy engine from being used for application deployment requirements necessarily. I think one could, one could allow an application deployer to specify in the OPA language the kinds of constraints they're interested in, and that would possibly be somewhat at odds with the API. I don't know, and maybe it's more too general language for that. But so when I talk about policy and application deployment requirements. I'm talking about it from a requirements point of view, not from an implementation point of view. I think you could potentially implement both of them using something like OPA, or both of them using an API, which is essentially what we do right now. I mean, we have things like quota and RBAC and things which are essentially policy. Users don't specify their RBAC or their quota. The administrator and specifier of the policy does, but we've implemented it using an API, and now we're considering implementing it using something like OPA or a policy language. So I just wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah.
Torrin's being quiet, so I assume he either approves or...
Yeah, no, Quentin, I think everything you said sounds reasonable. I mean, I think that where like the policy engine becomes useful is when you have like multiple parties that need to collaborate in some way on like the decision that gets made around like placement or overrides or whatever, right? So where you've got like the developer specifying some intent and the administrator specifying some like controls over how placement should work, and you need to have some way of combining those things to like run the system. And so that's where the policy engine becomes useful, because you can program it on the fly, right? It's not hard coded. That's where the power is. You can make those decisions on the fly. So that's what I would sort of keep in mind. So I'm all for like having these like developer intent specified, and then also having the ability to kind of add in the policy engine when you want to have that like control over composition. So
yeah, I agree. I guess the other perhaps useful distinction, without going off too far into the weeds, is that we have a reasonable understanding of application deployment technical requirements. Like, you know, I want these things close together, I want them far apart, etc. These are mostly technical considerations. I think as soon as you step into the policy world, many companies have weird policies that are very, very difficult for us to anticipate, and they tend to end up wanting to write them in pretty sophisticated languages. And that's where sort of a fairly, what's the right word, static API kind of breaks down. And that's where you need policy languages and such things.
When perhaps, so I wonder, when we say policy language, do we feel like OPA is an example of something that is sufficient, has the qualities of a policy language, or is more needed? I am fairly unfamiliar with the ins and outs of OPA.
I think that's slightly off topic, and I think we should maybe defer that to a different discussion focused on OPA. I mean, my superficial observation is that OPA is sufficient, but I don't know if we need to decide that here.
Yeah, I wasn't trying to make a decision in any way. I'm just trying to kind of know where to put OPA on the spectrum, but it's a distraction for now. So
it's
maybe
a very generalized, well, Torrin can talk in more detail if we need to, but it's a very generalized language for specifying quite complex policies.
I had a question here. Did we talk about or have an idea of, you know, where the affinity, anti-affinity would live relative to placement objects or the resources themselves?
I think we touched on that at the beginning of the call, and I don't think we've decided yet. I think we could go either way. You know, maybe the simplest starting point is to have them external to the objects, either in the placement constraints or as a separate API type that gets consumed by the, if there is an automated scheduler, could get consumed by those schedulers. And then at some point we might, you know, incorporate it into one of the other ones. And at least we can iterate fast and do stuff. Besides the iteration and kind of alphaness of it, I think it's kind of, because it's somewhat of a symmetrical kind of thing, it's very difficult to put it inside any given object that it is constraining, because it's usually constraining with respect to at least an other object, if not many other objects.
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I'll put a big +1 on what Quentin said, and Greg, I think that's a very good question to ask. One thing that I'll call out, which is present in my mind during these discussions, is that an advantage of separating this information into its own resource potentially means that we could have a reuse for it from other domains. So when we talk about templates and overrides and to some degree placement, it starts to sound very much like what things in the SIG apps kind of space like Helm describe. And one of the factors that I've been thinking would be wonderful to achieve is if we were able to reuse some of these ideas without having to, without a user having to take all of them. So for example, if we had some of these, if we had the affinity concept as its own resource, you could potentially apply that to another resource that would describe something like Helm charts, or there's a number of other things that are kind of in the same space that we can make addressable in a resource that encapsulated this thing. So I think that's another reason to at least start with it being a distinct idea.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
And not to tangent too far, but when I start to think about like the idea of defining a resource that collects other resources for the purposes of, determining how they should be deployed on a proximity basis, I also start thinking, well, once I've collected those resources together, via selector or whatever, I could also define like things like rollout strategy, like the concept of like, I'm going to redeploy this application. There's a new version. Currently we don't really have that concept in Kubernetes beyond like the deployment level, and it may make sense to consider that in the context of federation going forward.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. Things like updates are arguably more nuanced or more interesting in a multi-cluster environment where I guess high availability is arguably more important. In Kubernetes, you can just go and update a config map, for example, and everything that reads that config map kind of gets the update, and it's not entirely clear when each one of them does, and it's not clear how to canary a change in config. Whereas those are very common things in a multi-cluster scenario. You would definitely want to change your config in one cluster, see if it works, and if it does, then roll the new config out to other clusters. So I think a reasonable argument can be made for the fact that we need more sophisticated update semantics for our federated objects in general, not just for deployments.
Yeah, I second that, Quentin. And it sounds to me like if we go back to the whiteboard drawing in the brainstorming doc, it sounds to me when I think about rolling updates across clusters, there may be a missing piece that should be on that whiteboard drawing, or that this, I want to think of this as a concern for propagation, but it feels like maybe it's more than just an element of propagation.
Yes, closely aligned, but not the same thing. Yes.
Yeah.
And you may even find that it has got some crossover with policy. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Just a thought. I know at places like Google, there are actually kind of global policies, you do not roll out software to all data centers at the same time, full stop. And that's kind of something that groups like SRE like to enforce globally. whereas things like how much latency I need between my database and my server are much more kind of application level concerns that that deployers want to have control over. Those are often less subject to policy.
All right, I got some pen and paper, and I drew a little picture, and I didn't draw it on a whiteboard because I don't know if it's a good idea, and sometimes the whiteboard drawings take on this like professorial mode of communication. So I am going to draw it on the whiteboard.
You never look like a professor if you tried. I'm sorry to break this to you.
Let me draw it on the whiteboard now. So everybody else can see it, because like this is not good enough to like show. But I'm thinking about these three things that we're kind of dancing around, and I don't know how they relate to one another, but it seems like they do somehow. So there's the affinity concept, like resource affinity. And Quentin, maybe I'll wear my tweed jacket next time with the leather elbow patches. But resource affinity and app deployment, right? This is what we were talking about with the where things go together in groups.
Yeah.
And then there's like admin policy, which this is like example is Swiss data protection ordinance, and then there's also like declarative placement. I don't know how to spell declarative, apparently, when I'm using my hands to write. So we'll call that the accepted spelling. And I wonder if, so I don't have arrows or anything relating these things, but it feels like we should be able to draw some arrows or relationships between these. And I don't know exactly what they are. Is this a useful decomposition of this general area? Like, or am I wasting time?
Trying to put them together. So it seems like declarative placement is, or the declarative part of that is how you specify the requirements of your app deployment. And similarly, you may have declarative statements in your policy saying that, you know, we put stuff in Europe for these reasons, or we put stuff in Google Cloud for these reasons, or whatever. So I'm not sure that the declarative placement thing is super useful there. Other than the fact that it is the way you specify both of the above other things. I don't know, just a thought.
What's in my mind is, let me see if this makes sense. So who writes each of these? So this is app authors. If I understand the context of the discussion that we just had correctly, this seems like administrators.
Yeah. In the policy. Yeah.
I don't know, and I feel like there should be maybe an element of this that is like tools program this based on these.
Well, it could be both. I mean, in a simple system where you're not enforcing administrative policy and you just want to say, I want this stuff to go into this cluster, declarative placement is just like it's a primitive way of accomplishing that goal. And then you can certainly have tools on top of it that take other factors into consideration. And I think ideally they all boil down to this declarative placement. I think that's what you were saying, Quentin, as well, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I guess we don't need to get too hung up on terminology. I mean, in practice, once you know what the application deployer's requirements are and what you know what the policy is, and those kind of by definition live in different places in the system, you have to combine the two together, and then possibly with other things like resource availability and liveness of clusters and whatever, and then you need to come up with the general term for that is constraint satisfaction. So you've got a bunch of constraints, some specified and some by virtue of the real world, and you satisfy all those constraints and you come up with a solution. And we've been calling that scheduling.
Yeah.
right. I'm just imagining a world where, you can have scheduling and it can be as simple or complicated, as your use case requires.
Yeah.
But in the simplest possible case where I just have some resources that are going to put into clusters, I'm not doing constraint satisfaction, placement it can be static. And to me, it's just conceptually to think about it as layers. It just makes it tractable.
And so your constraint satisfy, if your only constraint can be put this in cluster X, that's the only constraint you allow, then your constraint satisfier is put it in cluster X. And yes, so I think that achieves what you want. If you want to allow more powerful constraints or more generalized constraints, like, put it in a PCI compliant European cluster, then and don't put it somewhere where I don't have quota, and don't put it somewhere where there isn't availability of resources, then your constraint satisfier has to get more complicated. But it only has to get more complicated if you want to support those kind of constraints. So if you just say, we don't do those, we only support, tell me the names of the clusters you want to go to and I'll put them there, then your constraint satisfier becomes negligible.
And so I guess I was thinking of constraint satisfaction as outside like a placement directive, but I guess that really it's the simplest possible constraint.
Yeah, I think in general it is. I mean, it is a form of constraint satisfaction, but yes.
Okay.
The ones you're thinking of are so simple that it's not worth putting a fancy name like that on them.
No, that's fine. I'm just making sure I understand.
I didn't actually mean to dominate this whole conversation. I just dumped some stuff in a document. I don't know if there's anything else people want to talk about today. Paul, you were going to go away and think about stuff and maybe come back with some insightful insights. And I think Maru the same. Did you guys have anything you wanted to share beyond this, or is this conversation going in roughly the direction you wanted it to?
I think this conversation is going in the direction that we wanted it to. This has been extremely useful today, for me at least. I unfortunately I had to spend yesterday concentrating on another area of my professional life, and so was not able to spend time thinking about this, about the discussion that we had on Monday. But this is definitely going in the direction I had expected to spend some time thinking about.
Okay, cool. Maybe we should, I think we've got into a slightly bad habit of 3 or 4 of us dominating the airwaves here. There's increasing numbers of people joining in. See, is that Lee there who's been quite active on the Slack channel? Hello, Lee.
Hi. Yep. Just ramping up, absorbing as much of the conversation as possible.
Awesome. And it's great to have people joining in. So maybe the 4 of us who've been making the most noise should shut up now and open the floor to anyone else who might have questions, comments, opinions. You're fun. You're one to have opinions and comments.
Yeah, I actually dropped off in between, so lost some portion of the conversation. Uh, but after the meeting last time, what uh, I have been thinking, and I have not been able to wrap my head around that is, like we already talked about, that we have at one end of the spectrum a simple, just a simple placement associated with a particular object. For example, just a replica set, you want to specify that this should be placed in cluster A and not in cluster B,
Hmm.
uh, which can be mapped, like what if I think in terms of placement as a resource, it can directly be mapped to the resource it wants to place using object reference. But that seems to me that in that case, this portion of information can in fact be in the same resource in the object itself.
Uh,
Uh,
yes, I think it's a good
so,
point.
so yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Let me complete. So,
Sure.
then I have been thinking that maybe we can have something like, if there is a possibility that both the direct object ref kind of a thing could be there in the placement objects, or object or multiple objects that we have been talking about, which certainly overrides any other parallel information which might also be there. Like label selectors can be there, or like what you described, affinity kind of stuff could be there. All these are parallel information which can be part of same placement object or different objects, but the direct object riff kind of a placement directive overrides everything else if it exists. If it doesn't exist, then controllers or whoever is implementing or the uh, the task of resolving where the object should be placed based on the affinity or the label selectors or whatever can kick in and take precedence.
Yeah, I think I see it slightly differently. So I think there are a lot of useful cases where you actually want to have both visible and enforced by the, let's call it a scheduler or constraint satisfaction thing. Um, so you might have a config map that needs to go in the same cluster as a replica set. And the config map doesn't really care where it is as long as it's wherever the replica set is. And then you have a different constraint, which is that the replica set needs to be in Europe because of policy. And then you have a different constraint that the replica set needs to be in a different data center than its backup replica set, because the administrator wants that. Sorry, the application deployer wants that. So I'm not sure, like as soon as you put a location constraint on something, I don't think it kind of negates all other constraints. It just becomes yet another constraint in the constraint graph. Don't mean to sound too philosophical about it, but yeah, I wouldn't want us to have a strict hierarchy where you know only one thing applies to a given entity, and there's a hierarchy of them, and the most important one overrides everything else. I think where there are conflicts, one could certainly imagine some things taking precedence over others. So we already have this concept of policy where, even if the application deployer wants to put stuff in cluster X, if the administrator said they don't have quota there or don't have RBAC rules to do that, they're like tough shit. That takes precedence over whatever the application deployer wanted. So in those cases, I think it makes sense to have a hierarchy. In other cases, I think it makes sense to try and achieve as many of these things as possible. Specifically where you can achieve all of them without having conflicts between the requirements. Does that make sense?
Yeah, why I mentioned this is because if we say probably define 5 different kind of placement objects or I don't know. I mean, call. Hello.
Yeah, we're still here.
Yeah, it does. IU. Yeah. So why I specified that is that if we have that kind of a hierarchy and it is explicit, in that case, the most simple cases might be pretty simple to implement. Whereas the more complex cases can be handled by more sophisticated controller or something like that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think there's a distinction between what I call would perhaps call absolute constraints, like this thing needs to go in Europe, and we don't need to know where anything else is because we know where Europe is, and we can just put it there, and that's a kind of an absolute constraint, which is different than this thing needs to go next to this other thing. And then we need to know where that other thing needs to be, which might need to be next to some other thing or not next to some other thing, etc. So I think that is, and maybe that's the distinction you're trying to make, is absolute constraints can be tied directly to the particular resources. This thing needs to go in Europe, or this thing needs to go in this cluster, as opposed to this thing needs to go in the same cluster as this other thing, and I don't care which cluster.
Correct. You summed it very nicely for me. I mean, I couldn't sum it that way.
And I guess that maybe gets back to what Maru mentioned. Sorry, I did promise to shut up, and I'm not really doing that very well, but I'll I'll try a little harder. But Maru, you mentioned you just want these things to be co-located. I think that was what you expressed as a simple requirement. But is it the case that you don't want to specify exactly where they're co-located?
Correct. It would just be a matter of
okay.
Whatever clusters they go into, it's all or nothing. There's no value in having individual resources propagated.
Okay. But you do recognize the distinction between specifying that resource A and B both need to go into cluster X, which is an absolute constraint and which doesn't give policy or placement any flexibility to choose somewhere else to put them, which is different than resource A and B need to go into the same cluster, and I don't care which one.
I guess I think of it as like there's a relationship between the resources in the case of saying these have to be deployed together, and there's a relationship between the resource and the cluster when you're saying these resources have to go into this cluster or that cluster.
Yes. And sometimes people use the latter to achieve the former if they don't have the ability to specify the former. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Cool. But it has the downside that it's much less flexible for the policy engine and the placement engine to decide where to put things. Cool.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, not when you were asking whether we'd covered the stuff from the last meeting or like what if we'd given it any further thought. I think my takeaway from the discussion was that it's not enough to have a separate placement resource if we're to enforce policy. Like it's almost like we need to be able to have it on a per resource basis, so that if I want to apply some sort of placement or affinity or any other of these different parameters that we're talking about for a given resource via a policy engine, there needs to be a canonical place to put it. And a placement resource seems like a poor fit if it's going to be related to the resources it's applying to via selector, because then a policy engine would actually have to watch all of the placement resources and to know which objects they refer to. And I guess that's possible. In my mind, it seems complicated enough that having the attributes directly on a resource, not solely, but for the purposes of enabling policy application. And maybe you'd have the resource-based one that would be flexible for the user, and you'd have the resource-based way of applying those rules so that it's tractable for a policy engine. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand you. I think we maybe need to make a distinction between one-to-one relationships. When you have a one-to-one relationship, you can either put the thing inside the resource because there's only fundamentally a one-to-one relationship. So you can either stick it in there, and status might be a good example. What is the status of this thing could go inside that thing. But if we don't quite know, haven't got agreement on what constitutes status and how we want to do it, then maybe we just leave it separate and we say, well, if you want to have a status associated with that thing, even if it's one-to-one, have at it, but outside of the core definition of what that thing is. So I think that's one set of arguments, and I agree that having them in the same resource makes implementation simpler in many cases, because policy doesn't have to go and pull a half a dozen different things together to figure out what's going on. It can just read the resource and it's got all the information there. But then it has the downside that we have to agree, and it's the core resource and all that stuff. So therefore we might split it out. I think we should see that as distinct from the case where we actually have something other than a one-to-one relationship, where we fundamentally want this thing to be shared amongst multiple resources. And whether that is a placement directive to say, like, all of these things are subject to the same placement, for example, or whether it is a proximity requirement saying that these things need to be proximate to each other. I think in that case, we don't have much choice other than to factor it out because of the fact that it's not a one-to-one relationship, unless we go and like duplicate stuff around the place or do funky stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction you're making is worthwhile. To me, it's kind of whether it's a separate resource or in the same resource. In this case, it's like the key factor is the fact that it's a one-to-one, whereas a placement resource might apply to many resources.
Yeah.
We're talking about more, a one-to-one relationship so that there's a canonical place to put a policy decision.
Yeah. And I guess if one goes overboard, you could imagine a case where, you have these single canonical thing, whether it's a placement resource or a proximity constraint or whatever, and you could actually have a controller that goes and pushes it into all the duplicates it into a bunch of actual resources so that everything else can only see them. I don't know. It's just a crazy idea, but denormalization is possible. It has downsides, but it is possible.
And the plus side that I saw for this, like what I was also mentioning, that the information about where the object goes, specifically with the object or per object basis, all the other things we are talking about, if none of them exist, they can still be enforced by using for example, policy engine externally decides which object goes where based on the labels or whatever, and then just enforces this on per object basis. So
I think that raises an important point, and I'm assuming this is what you were implying, is that we've been talking about policy applying to placement thus far, but there's no reason it can't be applying also to affinity and anti-affinity or proximity or any other decision.
For any of these constraints that we are talking about. So if we talk about the information which is associated with the resource, that information is sufficient to at least ensure which cluster this resource goes to or doesn't go to, and all of the I'm not sure what term to use. All of the other concepts can be applied using this alone. But the only point is, I mentioned about hierarchy or priority. So I'm not sure how to handle that. Like, this information is also present, and other, for example, a placement directive separately is also present. Then how exactly should we expect the system to handle this?
Conflict resolution, the joy of policy.
Well, I mean, one solution is to just not resolve conflicts and just say there is no solution. So if you have conflicting constraints and there's no solution that can satisfy all the constraints, you just say there's no solution, sorry. So that's the cheap and lazy way out of it.
It's a good starting point.
An example where there was policy that said you can't go in A, and the user said, I want to go in A, then you just say, sorry, there's no answer that gives you both of those, so we're screwed. And in other cases, you can try and drop some of the constraints in preference to others so that you can find a solution. And that's a classic kind of constraint resolution problem, is you take some of the constraints and you throw them away until you find a constraint graph that you can solve. And that implies a priority of the constraints.
This, to me, the concern is less about resolving conflict. It's more the fact that we're creating a system in which conflict is all but inevitable, and the user experience can suffer unless we have a way of clearly identifying what the problem is and how to resolve it. Like,
yeah, absolutely. So debugging unsolvable constraint networks is a thing, and there are reasonably straightforward ways of communicating like which constraints conflicted, and therefore, and you can even come back with a set of, if you drop this constraint, then everything would work. So this is the thing that's, throwing a spanner in the works. Or you can have systems that drop those automatically. So for example, what would be a good example? Yeah, I mean, one example might be if the user said they wanted in this cluster and maybe the policy said all your stuff goes in another cluster, then it would be technically feasible to just say that overrides the other one and wins. So you drop the user's requirement to go into cluster A and you stick him in cluster B instead. In that particular case, I don't think it's a very useful way of doing it, but there are other examples where it is useful. Which perhaps, we're out of time. We should continue another time.
good discussion, though. I think this is all super useful.
Okay, I'll see if I can find another 20 minutes in the next week to flesh out that doc a little more, but it sounds like there's a general agreement that it's not a completely ridiculous way forward, and we need to flesh out the details. If that's the case, I will try and do that. Feel free to comment and add your thoughts there as well in the meantime.
Yeah, the bell is ringing for me this week and Monday and today. Like I feel like there were like a truffle pig that is smelling some delicious mushrooms or something.
We feel honored to have rung your bell, Paul. I'm not sure I like the truffle pig idea, but otherwise it sounds very complimentary.
How about, I mean, the other one I had in mind was like the bloodhound that knows where the murderer went.
See if
Right.
that's appropriate.
I can make these up all day long, so just let me know if you want more.
That makes me frightened. You and Joe Bader should get in a room and have a war. You can come up with the most esoteric metaphors. All right. Cheers, guys, and welcome to all the new people. We'll see you tomorrow, I guess, for the when's multi-cluster next week. Do we have another one of these on Monday? Is that
next week?
Do we want to have one of these on Monday? I mean, I think these are productive, and
Yeah.
I think we have lots to talk about. So, I mean, I would vote for yes, to be honest.
I guess only if people have time to do anything useful between now and Monday, either think or write stuff down or do something useful. If we just start this conversation again on Monday, it doesn't sound like it's useful.
All right. Maybe having
I
some
think
concrete.
I think this time we can give a longer break. Means next meeting probably could be on Wednesday, and we would have enough time to maybe put something on in the document or think more about it.
You know what I think might be useful, Irfan, if you've had the time, is to actually just sort of change tack for a moment and have a look at what the outstanding concrete to-dos are that we have right now. I know you've been wading through all the Federation issues and identifying things that can be fixed now and all that. Do we want to maybe do that on Monday? If you have time to kind of prepare that?
I can do that.
Just to enable anyone here who wants to do stuff. I know Lee and maybe others are like quite maybe interested in gnashing their teeth on a starter project or something like that.
Yeah, I have a list of items, and what I'm trying to do is put up issues, and if they are something like simple ones, help wanted or good first issue labels on them.
Beautiful. Yeah,
So
let's do
people,
that on Monday
you
then.
can look
Sounds
for
cool to me.
them. Yep.
Okay, see you then.
All right. See everybody.
Ciao.
Monday then.